The most disturbing thing you can find in the woods isn't evidence someone got lost. It's evidence they stopped on purpose and never started again. Welcome to episode 5 of Scary Deep Woods Horror Stories. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave a like so you never miss the next episode. When someone secures their bike properly and hangs their helmet like they're coming right back, the question isn't where they went, it's what made them not come back. April 2017, Olympic National Park, backcountry trail system northeast of the Hoh River corridor, where mountain biking is allowed on specific marked routes. The one I'd known since high school went out for a solo ride on a Tuesday morning, experienced rider, someone who'd been on those trails dozens of times and knew the area well enough to navigate without maps. When he didn't show up for work the next day and didn't answer calls, his employer contacted his family. And his family called me because they knew we rode together and I might know which trails he preferred. I didn't know which specific route he'd chosen, but I knew the trailhead where he usually parked, so I drove out there Wednesday afternoon expecting to find nothing, because he'd probably just extended his ride and camped overnight without telling anyone. His truck was still there, same spot it had been parked 36 hours earlier based on the dust pattern and lack of disturbance. I called it in, and by evening we had search teams assembling because a missed work shift and an abandoned vehicle meant something had gone wrong, enough to break his routine. The first teams went out Thursday morning covering the main trail system, riding and hiking the marked routes, calling his name looking for any sign of a rider who'd stopped or crashed or needed assistance. Nothing on the primary trails, no disturbance. No skid marks in the dirt, no broken equipment, no response to calls echoing through the forest that should have carried far enough for someone within a mile to hear clearly. Day 2, we expanded the search radius, brought in additional riders who knew the trail system, covered the secondary spurs and access points that branch off the main routes into more technical terrain. I was part of the ground team working the northeast section, an area where the trail follows a ridge before descending into dense timber where visibility drops and navigation gets harder. 5 days after he'd parked his truck, one of the search teams found his bike. It was 2.7 miles from the trailhead, chained to a young Douglas fir just off the main trail, positioned upright and secure like he'd stopped for a quick break and was planning to return shortly. The lock was engaged, the chain looped through the frame properly, no signs of struggle or forced movement or distress anywhere around the location. His helmet was hanging from the handlebars, both water bottles were still in the frame cages, full caps sealed. His phone was in the frame bag, powered on, battery at 40%. I arrived at the location 20 minutes after the discovery call, saw it exactly as the first team had found it before anyone touched or moved anything. The bike looked like he'd be back any second, like he'd just stepped away to check something quickly and would walk out of the trees any moment, asking why so many people were standing around his equipment, but the ground around the bike told a different story than the bike itself told. The soil in that area is soft, holds impressions well, shows every boot print and hoof print and paw print from anything heavier than a squirrel. The bike's tire tracks were clear, arriving from the direction of the trailhead, stopping at the tree, the rear tire showing a slight skid from braking, but there were no boot prints leading away from the bike. None. The soft ground around the tree was undisturbed except for the tire impressions. No indication anyone had dismounted and walked in any direction from where the bike stood locked. I walked a full circle around the location, looking for prints I might have missed, areas where the ground was harder and wouldn't show tracks. The soil was consistently soft for at least 30 feet in every direction, and there were no boot prints anywhere except the ones being made by searchers who'd arrived after the discovery. The search coordinator documented everything before anyone approached closer, photographs from multiple angles showing the bike and the undisturbed ground, and the absence of any evidence someone had walked away. When they finally moved in to process the bike, I went with them, needed to see it up close because the wrongness of it was pulling at something I couldn't identify yet. The helmet was positioned carefully on the handlebars, not tossed, not dropped, placed with intention like you do when you're stopping briefly and want your gear organized for quick departure. The water bottles were full to the brim, no liquid missing, suggesting he hadn't been riding long enough to need hydration yet or had just filled them before stopping. The phone was unlocked, the screen showing his notes app open to a new entry. The coordinator read it aloud for the documentation recording. Found the spur trail, going to check how far it goes. Back in 20, timestamped at 09:47 Tuesday morning, approximately 2 hours after he would have left the trailhead based on the distance and terrain. No other messages, no calls made, no text sent, just that one note typed and left open like he'd written it for himself as a reminder of what he was doing. The coordinator asked if anyone knew what spur trail he was referring to, if there were unmarked trails in this area that branched off the main route. I checked the map, checked the GPS data we had for documented trails, scanned the forest around us looking for any obvious trail markers or cleared paths leading away from the bike location. There was no spur trail, no unmarked path, no cleared route, nothing that looked like anything except dense forest, with no indication anyone had ever walked through it. The search team spread out from the bike location, moving in expanding circles, looking for any sign of a trail or a path or boot prints or disturbed undergrowth that would indicate he'd walked in a specific direction. We covered a quarter-mile radius, every team member within visual contact of the next, calling out any findings, marking any disturbed ground. Nothing came back except negative reports. No trail, no prints, no broken branches, no fabric caught on bark, no evidence anyone had moved through the forest from the bike location. The dogs were brought in, started at the bike, attempted to track his scent away from the last known position. They circled the bike repeatedly, noses to the ground, working the same small area over and over without picking up a directional trail. One dog sat down and refused to work further. The handler saying that's the response when scent is present but not leading anywhere, like the source of the scent was there but hadn't moved from that point. Day 6, we pushed deeper into the forest surrounding the bike location, cutting transects through dense undergrowth, checking ravines and deadfall areas where someone might have fallen or become trapped. Every section came back empty, no physical evidence of human presence, no gear, no clothing, no disturbance. I kept coming back to the bike, staring at it, trying to make the scene make sense with what the ground was showing. He'd arrived, stopped, locked the bike, hung his helmet, typed a note saying he'd found a trail and would be back in 20 minutes. But the ground said he'd never dismounted, never walked away, never left the immediate vicinity of where the bike stood. Two pieces of evidence that couldn't both be true but both existed in the same space, demanding to be reconciled. Day 8, the search coordinator called a briefing, laid out the evidence map showing every covered section, every searched area, every location the teams had verified. The coverage was complete, overlapping in most places, extending far beyond the distance someone could walk in 20 minutes or even several hours. He asked if anyone had theories about the spur trail mentioned in the note, if there was any local knowledge about unmapped trails or old logging roads that might have been what was referenced. No one had information about trails in that specific area beyond what was already documented and marked. The forest around the bike location was old growth, never logged, no historical access routes, nothing that would create the appearance of a trail unless it was very recent or very faint. I asked if I could see the phone again, wanted to check if there were any other notes or messages that might provide context. The coordinator handed it over, and I scrolled through the Notes app looking for previous entries. Most were mundane, grocery lists, work reminders, bike maintenance schedules, but there was one from 3 weeks earlier that made me stop. Saw something weird on the ridge trail today. Looked like a cut-through heading east. Too narrow for bikes, might check it on foot next time. No follow-up entries, no additional details. Just that single observation from a ride 3 weeks before his disappearance. I showed it to the coordinator, asked if the ridge trail was the same area where the bike was found. He checked the GPS coordinates and confirmed the bike location was approximately 400 yards from the ridge trail mentioned. Close enough that if he'd been riding the ridge and seen something that looked like a trail, he might have come back specifically to investigate it on a day when he had time and wasn't trying to complete a longer ride. But that raised a worse question than it answered, because if he'd seen this spur trail 3 weeks ago and came back to check it, why was there no physical evidence of a trail where his bike was found? We searched the ridge trail area specifically, walking every foot of it, looking for anything that might have appeared trail-like, any break in the forest that could be mistaken for a path. The ridge was clear, well-maintained, no obvious spurs or branches leading off except marked intersections that were already documented. Day 10, I went back to the bike location alone, early morning before other teams arrived. Wanted to see it without the noise of multiple people and equipment and radio chatter. The bike was still there, still locked. Searchers had left it in place in case he returned and needed it. I stood exactly where the tire tracks ended and turned slowly, looking at the forest from his perspective, trying to see what he would have seen that made him stop and type that note. The trees were uniform, spacing consistent, no obvious landmarks or unusual features, nothing that stood out as different or interesting or worth investigating. But he'd seen something, written about it 3 weeks prior, come back to check it, stopped his bike here, and typed a note saying he'd found it and was going to see how far it went. I walked 20 feet into the forest in the direction the bike was facing, the direction he would have been looking when he stopped. The undergrowth was undisturbed, no boot prints, no broken vegetation, no indication anyone had pushed through recently. I kept walking, checking the ground, looking for any sign of a trail or path or cleared space. 50 feet in, I found a line of stones, small river rocks placed in a row too straight to be natural formation. The rocks were old, covered in moss, partially buried, but they formed a clear, linear pattern running northeast into denser forest. I followed the line, and every 20 feet there was another stone, another marker, creating a path that had no cleared ground but had definite intentional marking. A trail made of stones instead of cleared earth, something you wouldn't see unless you were looking for it specifically, something he might have noticed 3 weeks ago, come back to investigate, followed into the forest typing a note that he'd be back in 20 minutes. I marked my position, radioed the team, told them what I'd found, waited for others to arrive before going further. When the search coordinator reached my location, I showed him the stones, the pattern, the direction they led. He photographed everything, documented the spacing, followed the line with me deeper into the forest where the stones continued their northeast trajectory. We walked for 15 minutes, the stones appearing every 20 feet with perfect consistency, leading us into terrain that got progressively darker and darker despite it being mid-morning. Then the stones stopped. No final marker, no indication of destination, just the last stone sitting in moss with nothing beyond it except uniform forest. We searched the area around the last stone for any sign of him, any indication he'd reached this point and stopped or turned back or continued forward. Nothing disturbed, no prints, no broken branches, no evidence anyone had walked this far following the stone trail that didn't appear on any map. The search teams worked outward from the last stone, covering every possible direction he might have continued, checking for more markers or cleared paths or any indication the trail continued in a way we weren't seeing. 3 days of intensive searching in that specific area found nothing except the stone line that started 50 feet from his bike and ended 15 minutes into the forest with no explanation. The case file stayed open, classified as missing person, unexplained disappearance, no leading theory that accounted for all the evidence. His bike remained locked to the tree for 2 more weeks before his family claimed it, and when they unlocked it and pulled it free, the ground underneath showed no boot prints, no compression, no sign anyone had ever stood there. The stone trail was documented, photographed, coordinates logged, but no historical records existed for who'd placed them or why or when. I think about the note he typed, the confidence in it, the casualness of back in 20, like it was the most normal thing in the world to check an unmapped trail alone. I think about the ground that showed no prints, suggesting he'd never dismounted, and the stone trail that suggested he had and followed it far enough to vanish. 2 versions of what happened that can't both be true, but both have physical evidence supporting them. The search coordinator told me later that cases like this are the worst because there's no closure, no explanation, just evidence that contradicts itself, and a person who's gone so completely, it's like they were never there, except we know they were because the bike proves it. If you found someone's bike locked to a tree with their helmet hanging ready for return, water bottles full, phone showing a note saying they'd be back in 20 minutes to check a trail that doesn't exist on any map, and no footprints leading away, where do you search when the ground says they never walked away from where they stopped? Subscribe if that question stays with you. Hit the bell. Leave a like if you're still here thinking about it. Some trails don't take you deeper into the woods. They take you out of the woods into somewhere else entirely.